Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking to you on my perspective this week about the economic downturn that ends up being the Great Depression of 1930. You're discussing World War One, and of course, World War One was an interesting part of our history in that we didn't go into the war until the last year. We had been helping our allies by sending, weaponry and finances and all those things, and Woodrow Wilson actually runs and gets elected in his second term on the slogan of "He kept us out of the war." And then almost after his election, immediately we go into the war because our allies are losing ground, and there is a distinct possibility that they're going to be defeated by the Germans. And so we go in to win the war in a year. And in that course, in that year, this is our first foreign war, the first time that we have left the country to fight. And our women take up the jobs of their husbands for a year. And of course, they go back to their little sphere of domesticity after the war is over without much of a retort. In the Second World War, that will be different because our men will be gone 5 and 6 years, and women again have filled those places. And Harry Truman realizes when he's about to bring the troops home that it's not going to be that easy to get women to give up their jobs and the money they've gotten used to and the friendships they develop. And so he will start the veterans benefits and things after World War II to allow men to go to school. And so for the first time after World War II, men will be able to go to college. Normal, those in the middle to lower socioeconomic classes will go to college for the first time, and then they will come to expect their children will also go. So there's a lot of great things being changed with World War II. World War One is called the War to End All Wars. It was fought in the West, mainly as trench warfare. And you realize on the Allied side that they were in Belgium and Flanders, and the water table maybe 3 inches below the surface. So the soldiers fought most of that war up to their ankles or their knees or their waist or their chest sometimes in water. It was a horrible war. And so when they came home, they're looking just to get back to normal. And that is going to be one of the major parts of the Roaring Twenties that made it roar, is just that desire to get back to a normal life, get married, have children. And the economy, with one little blip in 1922, as they retool themselves and get back into a normal economy, is going to be pretty much a roaring runaway train. There will be a couple of real estate bubbles that burst, and nobody pays much attention to that. The stock market runs away. People are gambling on the stock market and buying on margins, and that in the end will cause the end of the economic train and engine, and as a result, will start the Great Depression. One thing you also need to note about capitalism is that every 10, 15, 17 years, we have an economic downturn. And we start noticing that more after the Civil War. 1873 is a panic, 1887 is a panic, 1893 is a full blown depression. And I would argue that the 1893 depression might have been greater than the 1930 depression. The reason that it doesn't get much of a read in history books and in the public is because we did not have very good communication. Remember, the difference between 1930 and 1893 was the presence of the radio. The radio had come to the front in 1920s as a ship-to-shore communication for the Navy. Probably no one ever realized that it would become this source of information for news and for music and all the other things that will feed the jazz craze of the 1920s. As we also have the Great Migration, the black former slaves or families of former slaves began to move north in the Great Migration to look for job interviews in the 1920s. And of course, we're under prohibition. There's no alcohol sold legally. So these speakeasies in New York become a place to get a drink and go listen to this great new music. And a lot of even white folks took their lives in their hands to go into the parts of town that were kind of dangerous just to get to hear the new music. But the radio made music come alive for folks, and that became a great source of entertainment. But it also, when the Great Depression started in the 1930s, became the source of Roosevelt's fireside chats and for breaking news. I mean, in World War II, they'll hear the blitzkrieg of London as the Nazis will be bombing the city. So it's going to rapidly change, folks. It's also going to rapidly change the information highway, in that people in 1893 were still very rural and were unlikely to even get a newspaper, maybe once a week if they're lucky, but they're not living in a city where they get more news by means of newspapers and periodicals. So 1893 becomes a huge economic downturn. 1907, 1917, then 1922. I mentioned to you in the announcement for the week, as they retooled to get ready to get over the war and move forward. There was a slight downturn there, and then of course 1930 becomes the one that everyone talks about, everyone remembers. Uh, Up until this point, we have pretty much followed the laissez-faire economic system. That is, that we know that capitalism has its peaks and valleys. And so when it hits a valley, we simply sit and wait for the peak to come back, and we don't do anything. That's exactly what Herbert Hoover, the Republican president, did leading up to the Great Depression. He sat in the White House and looked out the window and waited for the peak to come back. So he's well within the established economic system that they were going by. And in his defense, you have to understand, my grandparents despised the very mention of his name because most people blamed him and the Republicans for the Great Depression. But in his defense, the first bills that Franklin Roosevelt will sign when he's elected in 1932 are bills that Hoover had put into the hopper. So he had finally begun to move. Nobody was better prepared to be president than Herbert Hoover. Very well educated. He was wealthy. He actually rebuilt Europe after World War I and would be sent back as a former president to rebuild it again after World War II. You realize we're the only people in the world that go in and destroy our enemies' places of habitation and then build it back better before we leave. That is just an American idiom, I guess. But so anyways, Herbert Hoover fails. His name is pretty much mud after his term as president, and Franklin Roosevelt's elected in 1932 and begins his New Deal for the American people. There will be a depression within a depression during the 1930s. Around 1935, Roosevelt has to reconfigure his New Deal in order to help people. People were resistant to help because they had lived all these years under the laissez-faire system. You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And so they were resistant to change. And one of the things that Roosevelt had to figure out was how to help people when it didn't seem to be a handout. And of course, Social Security was one of those things. Oh, they gave away everything. They gave away mules. They gave away bedding. My grandparents were recipients of both of those programs. And it wasn't quite so bad. They weren't handing you money, so to speak. And so it kind of helped preserve the dignity of those who had been raised to work and who struggled in taking handouts. The real savior, if you will, for the economy of America was actually World War II. Retooling for a war economy put people to work, and we manufactured weaponry, and it carried us well through the war. So much so that at the end of the war, when we're thinking about bringing troops back home, we had millions of men overseas. The concern was if we bring them back to no jobs, then we'll have another depression. So there's always that fear there. And Harry Truman did, I think, an admirable job in preparing us for, a new economy moving forward and doing that. Pretty good for an accidental president who was not prepared when he stumbled into the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt. So I hope some of these things will kind of help you think about the situation you're looking at. Very interesting situation, the Great Depression, the Roaring Twenties, the World War One, and you will realize that when you study World War One, that it was the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War One that set up World War Two. In attempting to not ever have another war to end all wars, they literally gave the seeds of World War II into the hands of people like Benito Mussolini and the Italians, and eventually Adolf Hitler, that would bring about World War II and the catastrophic end that we have there. If you have questions or comments, I welcome those. And I look forward to us having a great week as we discuss the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression and what made those things so important and how they happened and how we ended up solving those problems. Thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.